A very warm welcome to this important event. So my name is Helen Painter. I'm director of the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence, which is pleased and proud to host this event tonight from looking at Dr. Valerie Hobbs' book. Valerie is one of our research associates in addition to her other roles, which I'll speak about in a moment. The Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence is a postgraduate research centre looking at studying in two areas. One is the interpretation of biblical violence, and the other one, more relevant to our conversation this evening, is the use of scripture, the use of the Bible in a violent world. And we seek to do both academic research, but also events that and produce resources that make an impact in the local church. And I think that our conversation this evening will very much be straddling that area. So that's enough about the CSBV. We're here tonight tonight for my time. Some of you I know are in the States, and it's afternoon for you, I guess. But we're here today to discuss this very important book by Dr. Valerie Hobbs called No Love in War, A Story of Christian Nationalism. This book is an auto-ethnographic account of Valerie's life as she grows up in a cult in the USA, a cult which exhibits features of the New Apostolic Reformation, Christian Reconstructionism, and Neo-Calvinism. This evening, we're going to hear from Valerie first and then from three respondents before we open things up for conversation and questions. So let me introduce our speakers tonight. So first of all, Dr. Valerie Hobbs. Valerie is a linguist at the University of Sheffield, where she teaches and researches on religious language. She is particularly interested in the many ways language encodes, enacts, and resists violence. And then the first of our three respondents is Dr. Carol Ann Vaughan Cross. She's an associate professor at Samford University, where she researches social history at the intersection of religion, technology, and culture, sex and gender. Our second respondent is Dr. Julie Ingersoll. Julie is a professor of religious studies at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, where she teaches and writes about religion in American culture, focusing especially on religion and politics and the religious right. And our third respondent this evening is Dr. Angie Wilson. Angie is a professor of politics at the University of Manchester, where she explores the intersections of social conservatism, Christianity, feminist political theory, and policies regulating sexuality. So thank you all for making the time to be with us this evening. Right, I think that is the introductory stuff out of the way. So as we lead into Valerie beginning to speak about her book, I wanted to open by reading just a short section. And if you happen to have the book and you're interested, I'm reading from page 129. And Valerie says this: "Leave no trace, we're told, when hiking, camping, working outdoors. The world is in some ways better without us human pollutants, so the thinking goes. So we preserve, pick up after ourselves, show respect for the locals, leave what we find, minimize our footprint. In doing so, we aim to show love and respect for our planet." There's more to this, though. Leaving no trace is also troubling, since acts of erasing, of collective forgetting and moving on, are also means to hide from the truth and revel in conspiracy, also to suppress acts of injustice. Leave no trace is, after all, also the slogan of the criminal, the human trafficker, the slave owner, the rapist, wiping his fingerprints, cleaning the crime scene, removing any identifiable fibers or cells that might link him to a particular place or person, as if he was never there. As if. Leaving no trace is indeed the perpetrator's tool, and telling stories, actively choosing to remember, is an act of resistance, and it's an act of defiance and courage. And that's what Valerie has done in her extraordinary book. And I'm going to hand over to her now to tell us more about it.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'm just going to share my screen now. sorry. There. Okay, I'm quite a visual person, so I've got slides. Thank you so much all for coming to this event. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Bible and Violence, and especially to the Reverend Dr. Helen Painter for hosting and moderating this event. Thank you to my radical open access publisher, Mayfly Books, together with my editor, Dr. Martha Eric, who is, I believe, here in the audience tonight. And of course, a special thanks to Professors Julie Ingersoll, Angie Wilson, and Carol Ann Von Cross for their investment in my work and their preparation for this event. I'm just so pleased to have reached this point, and I am grateful to all of you who have been part of the process of writing this book. About 8 years ago now, I was happily doing various projects researching the language of philosophy when a minister in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church in the United States contacted me to ask for my help. He had known me at Covenant College and thought I might be interested in witnessing and talking about violence in the church. A minister was facing an ecclesiastical trial for refusing to require his disabled wife to attend church. My department supported me financially in attending the trial, and that trip and the projects that followed changed the trajectory of my career, leading me to begin getting to grips with an ignored area of research among linguists, religious language, what it looks like, and more importantly, what it does. This led me rather inevitably to face my own history, which is the focus of this book, No Love in War. I want to say first that for this event, I'm wearing one of the artifacts of my childhood, which you can see here, and I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. This badge containing a picture of me when I was 4 years old. My first school picture in a Baptist kindergarten in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. I do this because the book we're talking about is in many ways a book about violence against children. Some of us here tonight spent our formative years in religious communities of violence. Bell Hooks calls these years the original school of love. And for us, some of us, we were schooled in love infused with cruelty. American novelist William Faulkner wrote that the past is never dead. It's not even past. And so I'm wearing this badge today to acknowledge the inner child, still very much alive, that we all bring with us today. We who grew up in violent spaces, maybe are in violent spaces now, know about the power of self-parenting our inner child in the process of healing from trauma, in acknowledging our own political and civil rights, our autonomy. Where the adults in our lives did not build for us a secure, loving world, we do this now for ourselves. So in the time I have now, I will cover a few points about the book. First, I'll explain a little bit about Christian dominionism. I'll talk a little bit about the shame violence cycle, and then a bit about my approach to this book. So first, a few points about Christian dominionism. Here's a quote from Gary North, a Christian Reconstructionist, one of perhaps the most radical Christian dominionists in the United States. Christian dominionism is, first of all, an overtly sacralized version of human, especially white male supremacy. So this dominion that Gary North is talking about, it engenders a one-up, that is a domineering, and one down, that is submitting, binary social relation. It also involves black and white thinking and rigid ideology and dogmatism. So a lot of certainty. Christian dominionism is by nature evangelical. So there's a focus on persuasion of various kinds, some more violent than others. And it contains significant overlap with Christian nationalism and a slew of similar kingdom building ideological movements. So when you see things like corporate activities for cities and regions, this is a sign that there's dominionism at work. And then Christian dominionism in its various forms has powerfully shaped the face of white evangelicalism in the United States and globally. Finally, Christian dominionism's natural consequence is everyday violence. Now, of course, next, you know this book, No Love and War, is a story about violence. It's an ugly book, it's an angry book. And like most survivors of violence, I wrote it as a last resort for a set of communities who continue to this day to commit acts of violence and then to conceal these acts of violence. So why are these communities violent? A lot of this, of course, is about power. Power is central to the Christian dominionist, as it is to all human supremacists. People who get a taste of power often do not want to let that power go, and violence helps them hold on to it, to stay on top. It helps them to dominate and to keep others submitting. But also, violence is a significant part of the cycle of shame. Now, it's important to say that not everyone who has unresolved trauma will commit violence against others. But violent people often have unresolved trauma of their own from violence perpetrated against them. This suffering, if untreated, if unresolved, leads to intense chronic shame. And this shame, if also unresolved, is powerfully linked to the desire to enact violence against others. Here's one representation of this cycle. Why does shame have the potential to lead to violence? Because oppressive forms of anger and violence, either against oneself or against others, are short-term coping mechanisms to compensate for that shame, to compensate for those threats to a person's self-esteem. I'll just say that part again. Oppressive forms of anger and violence, either against oneself or against others, are short-term coping mechanisms to compensate for threats to a person's self-esteem. We're not meant to be, our self-esteem is not meant to be eroded. We're meant to be built up and loved and supported. And when we're not, these kinds of things happen. So I talk in the book about the stresses within and between us building internally until occasionally they exploded unexpectedly. This is that anger that when concealed and suppressed and without a healthy outlet builds and builds as in a pressure cooker and eventually explodes. So for example, in her book, See What You Made Me Do, Power, Control, and Domestic Abuse, Australian journalist Jess Hill writes that traditional notions of masculinity, particularly male entitlement, are at the core of men's violence against women. And these traditional notions, this male entitlement, is branded as biblical within Christian dominionism. So perpetrators are violent because of a desire for power over others and because of shame. And in order for this cycle to carry on, they also must conceal. This is what Helen was talking about at the beginning, that leaving no trace. You must conceal, they must suppress the truth. They must suppress resistance, like critique, like healthy, productive expressions of anger and truth-telling in those they harm. So victims, women especially, are told to be nice and play nice. And here we find terrible misinterpretations of the biblical advice to turn the other cheek. And by the way, I recommend Helen Painter's book here on the Bible and coercive control, as she talks about this phrase and its misuse. That's one of the best parts of this book, I think. So evidence of Christian Dominionist suppression of anger, and especially women's anger, can include things like their emphasis on certain, often heavily gendered expressions of politeness. So in my circles in the American South, it took the form of ladylikeness, being gentle and meek and sweet, though I have definitely seen this in Christian churches in the United Kingdom as well. So this behavior is gendered as desirable feminine qualities, and then it's used as tools of control, of silencing, of concealment. So this concealment is quite important for the cycle of shame and violence. As a victim of violence myself, as a mostly unwilling participant in various communities of violence, for many years, as you can read in the book, I carried a burden of immense false guilt and shame. Some of that was, of course, due to my rage, which is a very natural response to being traumatized and violated. And this rage was seen as inappropriate, even unchristian. God didn't want me to be angry at my holy overlords. The violence I carried out as a coping mechanism was, and it still is, most frequently directed against myself. As I document in my book, I regularly hurt myself. My unresolved trauma also manifested in various chronic illnesses. This was how I consciously and unconsciously coped with violence that as a child I could not stop and I could not heal from. It was only after I moved far away from these communities as an adult and when I began to embrace my rage. I looked it in the eye, I accepted it, I accepted myself, I stopped concealing what happened. I began to heal then from this cycle of violence and shame, and rather than suppressing my anger, rather than concealing it, I channeled it into productive expression. So I consider this book one such expression, as ugly and as raw as it is. So remember this: anger as a response to violence, and indeed all injustice, can be principally a vital expression of love for yourself, for other people who are suffering. It is what we do with that anger that matters. So how do we break this violence, shame cycle? Some of us some of us here in the audience tonight have done the excruciating work of breaking this cycle, and it is so hard, especially because healing cannot happen alone. We need safety and support. We need a safe place to grieve. We need to be able to name and confront fear. We need a solid landing space from which to begin to open ourselves up again to relationships. And that's for those of us who are victims. As for perpetrators, and some of us may be both, there has to be a willingness by perpetrators of violence to hear the truth from those they've harmed. So we're resisting that concealment. We have to hear the truth and then to echo that truth, to witness the pain and destruction wrought by the actions of power-hungry religious extremists, and also to feel that shame, to face the shame without hiding from it, without covering it over, without concealing it through more acts of violence. This is how we break the chain of harm. And this is where faith comes in. I consider it a test of religion, the extent to which any religion offers us true freedom from this cycle of violence I've been talking about, instead of enabling us to continue in the cycle, to free us from it. So then finally, let me say a little bit about my choices around the writing and publication of this book. I've been incredibly lucky to work with Mayfly Books, which is an independent, radical academic press, which publishes books available free of charge in e-version and as affordable paperbacks. This fits perfectly with the ethos of this book. Firstly, because as an academic, I consider myself a public servant. and I believe my work should be accessible to anyone who wishes to access it. And second, because as I began to shop around for a publisher, I realized more and more that I did not want to require that victims of violence pay money for what is in many ways a story about all of us. Nor do I want to accept money from perpetrators of violence. No Love in War is an auto-ethnography. This is a kind of academic method which connects the autobiographical and personal to the cultural and social. And I chose this approach in direct defiance to those, especially in the Christian Dominionist movement, who continue to claim to hold the keys to absolute truth, to some kind of version of objectivity. People who reserve the right to object to any talk about what is personal unless it's personal to them. This too is how they hide their violence, and I am done helping them hide. Someone asked me the other day what I hope for this book, and I said in many ways what I hope has already happened. Just as writing this deeply personal book is an act of resistance against the cycle of violence and shame and religious extremism, against the Christian Dominionist movement, against the amassing of empire, so also are my hopes acts of resistance. They are fulfilled simply in people like you picking up this book and witnessing the stories in it. In some cases, even connecting the dots to your own experiences. I hope for relief for everyone who picks up this book, even for perpetrators, to be released from the shame underpinning their own violent acts. I hope for peace. And I know that for some people, that peace can only come about through facing the shame that is this book's existence. The shame that is their personal involvement in the stories contained in it. I know many are still hiding, still concealing. I hope this book might help them finally stop hiding as I have. Thank you for reading.
Thank you, Valerie. That was very helpful, and I think for those who haven't read the book, a provocation to go away and engage with it. So we're going to come on to our first respondent now, and that is Dr. Caroline Vaughan-Cross.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Valerie, for the invitation to participate in such an important conversation. Thank you for your courage to share such deeply personal experiences and for contextualizing them for us in the history of Christian Reconstructionism and the Dominionist movements. I grew up in Bible Belt, Alabama. My doctoral work at Auburn was in American religious history, Southern history, women's history, so Southern religious women. And I've been teaching at Samford University here in Birmingham for many years. And I study women in the Southern Baptist Convention and their networks. When I first came to know Dr. Hobbs' scholarship on religious women's rhetoric, I had no idea then that she had grown up so close to my own home. Much of what she describes in this book is sadly familiar. It makes sense to me now. I can see her bringing to bear in this memoir her scholarly expertise in religious language and theolinguistics and what they do. In this act of remembrancing, Valerie has done what ethnographer Anne Farrell calls the process of locating the tellable in an untellable story. And what she is telling are dynamics still at work in authoritarian spaces today. Reading this memoir reminds me of reading Harper Lee's Go Set a Watchman, which I frequently teach with some of my students, because of the ways these cultures intentionally cultivate children as little watchmen of carefully constructed walls around a perpetually Confederate social curriculum. The verse in Isaiah says, "Go set a watchman, let him declare what he seeth." And the watchman and scout answers, "Babylon is fallen, and all her graven images of her gods have broken on the ground." Sometimes the kids get loose when they're sent up on the walls and look around and see what's on the other side. And then they look back again at their own culture. Some, like Valerie, do as the Lord commands to tell what they have seen. The themes of seeing and telling are profound in Valerie's story. As she tells us in the final sentence, "I will not look away." It's a resilient, tenacious, loving look at the real. Go Set a Watchman was the first story that Harper Lee tried to tell about what she had seen and heard in this same culture, and struggled to learn as a 20-something white female who was somewhat developmentally delayed in her awareness of herself and her own culture, and returns to the scene of various crimes, trying to find truth that she slowly comes to realize she had been kept ignorant of by adults in her own family, and she doesn't know how to feel about them now. Valerie allows us to see how such silencing and unknowing work as social epistemologies or ways of knowing, how such ideologies of dominance and submission are recursive, repeated, amplified, how they feel to people inside them, as if they're inevitable or unstoppable. Sociologist Jennifer Mueller notes how white college students in the Bible Belt in the 20-teens evidence this with white supremacy, using language of learned, willful ignorance, so-called colorblindness, evasion tactics, and tautological ignorance, or saying the same thing in different ways over and over again. I mention this because there's a stream of consciousness in Valerie's writing, like Harper Lee's Go Set a Watchman, as the past and the present run together, and she struggles against these entwined social mentalities of white supremacy, male supremacy, Christian supremacy. We're allowed inside the mind of the young person trying to make sense of the senseless, name the unnameable, especially after being denied language or permission to use it about violence. Valerie shows us what it is like inside the body's physiological responses that are often our first truth tellers of what we cannot yet tell ourselves or others. She does not shy away from the truth of what scholars in memory studies call implicated subjects. Victims, perpetrators, and bystanders all caught together in a web of trauma wrapped in religious rhetoric. This was a culture in which, Valerie writes, violence shaded all my church school days. We were pushed and smacked, threatened, whittled down with words, eyes, hands, objects. Boys harassing and bullying girls and other boys on a daily basis was treated by adults as normal in ways that, if uninterrupted, only escalated with more acts of entitlement, possession, and violence, with distorted ideas of the heroic. Of particular interest to me are Valerie's recollections about other women in such patriarchal cultures. She writes with sensitivity about women who were exhausted and exploited while doing what they'd been told was good for them and their children. Much psychosociological research has shown how fearful women in these groups are of transgressing boundaries, how they can be more risk averse, more conservative than men, because they're less free to push boundaries as the men do with impunity, without attracting highly negative social consequences enforced by other women. They can be more intolerant than men towards political outgroups due to their greater social distance from them, because isolation inside their own exclusive in-group works as intended. This makes them vulnerable to religious and political pyramid schemes, as Valerie shows, a phenomenon directly related to the fact that finding authentic solidarity with other females is excruciatingly difficult for girls in Valerie's youth. Getting women to espouse their own subjugation has always been an important mechanism of patriarchy. It produces more complicity and more control. It reifies passive aggressiveness and perpetuates dysfunction, danger, violence. Valerie describes it as a prescribed inability to indicate our own wishes, our own interests, our own disinterest, our own dislikes, without a male head and voice placed on top. Many such women and girls over-report and over-perform their religiosity in exaggerated competitive ways. They sanction other women with what Valerie calls pick-me energy to get men's attention and approval by policing other females so unlovingly and so unkindly. Internalized misogyny and externalized insecurities remain a grotesque feature of these cultures, where females are rewarded for pridefully displaying how much they hate equality, including their own. A frustrating and harmful reality is that many of these women have survived their own brutalization, and they exhibit hatred of other victims of brutality whom they perceive as receiving attention and care they felt denied to them or that they rejected. They believe that strong women, godly women, just handle it and stay silent as they did. They're still terrified, but loath to identify themselves as victims with wounds in circumstances they believe they chose and are responsible for. Instead of being inspired by other women saying, if she can do this, so can I, some women look at other females and say, if I couldn't do that, why can she? Who does she think she is? The scenario breaks my heart. Valerie shares painful stories of women abusers of children and youth in their own homes and authoritarian church schools. This hermeneutic of hierarchy drawn from Roman household codes in the New Testament, with Christian men viewing themselves as the new patriarchs of Israel, subjugated women as mistresses over children and slaves as the property of the patriarch. It's not an accident or a surprise that these cultures revere the Confederacy in their curriculum of Christian nationalism. I suspect it's difficult, as it should be, for outsiders to fathom Valerie's account of the sadistic ballet of the 10 virgins with little girls in tights and leotards, with violent, bloody abortion porn, all in the same program in a Christian church school's public performance, directed by a woman, replete with verbal and corporal punishment to get them there. Valerie writes that it reverberated all around us in this church school complex, and we did not open our mouths, and no one came to aid. Throughout all of these frustrating things, there are a few, though not enough, glimmers of hope. A college teacher who says, I see you. And I don't think it's an accident that Valerie has spent so much of her teaching career helping students articulate and use language well in their own lives, because it's life-saving and life-sustaining. Or that her relationship addresses pedagogy, helping classroom teachers become better at seeing students and understanding the processes of learning and unlearning and knowledge development. Valerie's memoir is, I believe, a call for all of us to look for and at the Valeries still out there. Biblical scholar Amy Cottrell advocates in her book, Uncovering Violence, Reading Biblical Narratives as an Ethical Project, that we are attentive to these individual stories like Valerie's with critical and compassionate listening that require reflection, as Valerie has done, on our own response. What kind of violence, for example, is simply taken for granted as normal, and what enables that sense of ordinary violence to thrive unresisted, silently accepted? In conclusion, I want to say that Valerie's theme of the real and real love is crucial. Love is unfortunately a well-raped word, misused and abused. Failure to love fully is a deadly sin of acedia, of sloth, absence of love. And this is a story of acedia and its deadliness, but Valerie does not end it without faith and hope in love with a capital L, especially for those coming out of such fundamentally flawed and dangerous theologies and cultural practices. Her memoir reminds and encourages me that perfect love rejoices in truth, not its distortion. And learning more of the truth, of course, can be painful as we come to these realizations, these epiphanies, like Scout Finch or Valerie Hobbs, refusing to look away. Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for those thoughtful and helpful remarks. We're going to move straight on now to our second respondent, Dr. Julie Ingersoll. When I can find you, I will spotlight you. Can't see you at the moment.
You can't see me?
No.
Can you hear me?
Yes, but I'm looking to spotlight you and I can't find your icon. Gotcha.
Got me?
Yeah, hold on.
Great. Hi, everybody. I just want to start by also thanking the organizers and Valerie for this opportunity today. This book has really affected me in some ways that I didn't expect when I picked it up, and I hope to talk to you a little bit about that. It's interesting for me as an academic speaking to an audience that is mixed between academics and people who have had experiences with the communities about which I write. And it's also new to me to engage with books that are described as auto-ethnographic. In my training, the practice of othering the folks about whom you write was required. And so the personal quality of these newer books called auto-ethnographies is sometimes a little bit jarring for me, but also challenge me and lead me to think in ways that I don't normally with academic books, where there's a comfort in distancing myself from the uncomfortable things about which I write. So my comments today are going to be more personal than what is typical for me, actually. And I hope you'll indulge me a little bit. And I take Valerie's work as an invitation to think about this book in terms of my own background and my own life. This is a powerful, poignant book, and it's beautifully written. I've followed a few conversations on Twitter about it. Yes, Twitter still gasps for life. And I'm moved by how it struck a chord among those of us who share this unfortunate sisterhood. For context, I too have a personal background here. I wasn't raised in this world, but I married into it. I married the son of another well-known figure, the brother of a publisher of many of Rushduni's books. I spent many evenings listening to Rush, North, Bonson, Chilton, Jordan, and others in the family living room when they visited. So I read Valerie's book with a visceral knowing about the stories that she tells. Silenced, sidelined, dismissed, belittled, invisible, condemned to a shrinking world, infantilized, dominated, dissected, consumed, absorbed, erased. These are words that I lifted out of this book, but also words that I would have put into this conversation if I were writing it myself. Man made in the image of God, woman in the image of man, a helpmeet corresponding to him, a helpmeet in his exercise of dominion. I wrote my dissertation, which became my first book, about what I labeled subtle arrangements and little things that govern us. The tiny little ways women's submission is relentlessly policed. Slights, often so small, were made to seem like bitches if we point them out. I was writing about other women, my research subjects, but I wasn't yet far enough from my own past to see that I was writing about myself. I had left already, but this was before social media and podcasts, before ex-evangelicals and deconstructing were things. Those of us who left in those days did it on our own. And I found my place to speak again by writing about them. I told my own truths with their words. But that was decades ago. I made progress, worked my way out, and now that seems like a lifetime ago, maybe 2 lifetimes. But no love and war reminded me. It brought me face to face once again with what I remember most about my time in that world. My own struggle to exist, to just breathe. It was a tough read. Silenced, sidelined, dismissed, belittled, invisible, condemned to a shrinking world, infantilized, dominated, dissected, consumed, absorbed, erased. This is not a form of submission that is content with compliance and obedience. This is a form of submission that requires the abandonment of personhood. Women's erasure is the weapon that enforces this kind of submission. Erasure is a thread that runs throughout this book, but it's nowhere more vivid than in the section where Valerie unearths details about the divorces of 2 icons of Christian Reconstruction, Greg Bonson and Rushduni himself. These divorces would be scandalous if they were acknowledged, if the men's neatly cleaned up one-sided versions weren't the only versions allowed to exist, or if the women whose carefully curated lives were written by the men could speak their own truths for just a minute. But sadly, they can't. The women were said to have been inadequate to their callings to serve. They had abandoned these iconic men. The men weren't in any way inadequate because they and those like them told the stories. What was told of the stories anyway. Mostly everything was hushed up and no one was permitted to ask questions, least of all women. Valerie pulls together more details about these women, their lives, and yes, their divorces than any other writer I'm aware of. You'll have to read her book if you haven't already for the details, but this was a really gripping read. When I did my fieldwork for my own book on Christian Reconstruction, I met up with a younger figure moving into leadership in the movement. And when I said my book was about Rushduni's legacy, he jumped to the conclusion that I was a supporter. When he learned that I was a critical academic, he was angry and emailed me. He said that he, quote, knew all about me, that I had abandoned my husband, and so on. Shocked, I replied that he knew nothing about me or my former marriage, and then promptly forgot the exchange until I read this book. I suddenly understood it's a formula, and he didn't think he needed to know anything about my side of the story to come to strong conclusions about what was true. My story had been, in Valerie's language, passed through the filtering lips of men. I'd been gone more than a decade, and I was certainly no important figure, nor was my former husband. And yet there's a story about us, about me having abandoned him. There was a story created, as Valerie put it, by men talking mostly to other men about a woman. I had this reaction more than once reading this book. What Valerie does here is capture the subtle arrangements and little things. You can go to the beach and see the beach, but to know it, you need to see the grains of sand. No love in war is a magnifying glass on the gritty details. Now, I find these kinds of events most productive for conversation, so I've kept my own comments brief. But I have one conclusion. Oh, my mouse is messing up here. Sorry. This brings me to my final point. Something else important that those of us who've left this world share. The knowledge of our complicity. Complicity in the silencing of women, but more. We're aware of the parts we played in the project of Dominion, the project that has brought the US to the brink of authoritarianism. It takes forever to unravel all the damage this world does. And Valerie's book has marked another chapter in that process I thought was long finished for me. I commented in one of those Twitter discussions that this is why my young ex-evangelical friends have aptly named the process deconstruction. Those who know me are familiar with my tendencies toward darkness. I'm the one who always sees how bad things can really get, and I expect that they will. For that reason, I keep my hopeful, optimistic friends close to give me balance. Knowing this, I asked one of those hopeful, optimistic, lifelong friends how I might end talks like this when people want hope. Her husband piped up with the observation that she and I, and by implication, many of you here, are the hope. We got out and are still working to make amends. Thanks again for allowing me to speak to you, and I look forward to the rest of our conversation.
Thank you so much, Julie, and especially for finishing on hope.
I try.
And now we come to our third respondent, Dr. Angie Wilson, and I can see you, Angie, so I shall swap that to you.
Excellent, thank you. Hi, everyone. So my name is Professor Angela Wilson. I'm a professor of politics at the University of Manchester. My work sits at the intersection of religion and politics, but I have an expertise in the US Christian right. My expertise is academic. I have recently finished a book that involved participant observation with various Christian right political organizations like the Family Research Council, and looks at discourse analysis, so similar to some of the stuff that Valerie looks at. But my relationship to the work is also personal. I am a Texan. You may not hear it, although late in the day, the accent does tend to come out again. I've been in the UK for 30 years, but I grew up in the Texas Panhandle. My father was a Methodist preacher in the Texas Panhandle, and my mother was a reluctant preacher's wife. My mother came up a lot as I was reading this book. My mother was an insider-outsider. My father went into the ministry in his 30s, and my mother had said she had absolutely no intention of ever being married to a pastor. But she found herself married to a pastor and having 4 kids, and at that point in history, not able to kind of make another choice. There was an image of my mother in church, the pastor's wife, and the image of my mother when the door was shut in the parsonage. So my mom in the parsonage could quite easily talk about, and I use her language, not my own, the old biddies in the church. And by what she meant by that was the women that came around, and it was the mid-60s and 70s, the women that came around telling her what to wear or what her children should be wearing or what color the walls on the parsonage should be and what the furniture should be like. So my mother was, as I often say in my work, my mother knew absolutely nothing whatsoever about the feminist movement of the 70s, but she so embodied it. So I want to start for a moment with a quote from Lucy Stone, an abolitionist and suffragette from 1855. Lucy Stone writes, "In education, in marriage, in everything, Disappointment is the lot of women. It shall be the business of my life to deepen this disappointment in every woman's heart until she bows down to it no longer. I begin with this quote for two reasons. First, to acknowledge the importance of auto-ethnography as an important methodology for observation of society and social interaction. My own book written, my previous book written a while ago now, Below the Belt, was a similar telling of my relationship to the South. The sharing of authentic lived experiences is humankind's way of connecting us with one another, of learning about each other. Early humans shared narratives of joy, of finding food and shelter, and of the dangers lurking in the wilderness in which they lived. Academic investigation and analysis often leans toward the quantifying or the qualifying of those experiences to find a norm, an average, a commonality, and for good reason, in health sciences, for example. But academic investigation and analysis also focuses on the social power to define those norms, and in doing so, seeks out narratives of the margins. How else can we fully understand our social connections, our norms and our values, without investigating those boundaries we have used to establish the us and carefully distinguish it from the other? Of course, in perfect academic style, I'm desperate to go like that, but I won't. The bravery of articulating a voice from the margin should never be underestimated. The bravery of questioning boundaries, of stepping back from those boundaries and asking why. Why, and by whose power, and in whose name, was it determined that my relationship to you, to the other, to the rest, was prescribed in this way? So I applaud Valerie's bravery in sharing her experience of life, her authenticity, her publicly sharing her story. Even though as a preacher's daughter from Texas, at times, it was really not easy to read, Valerie. I just want to be honest with you about that. I am absolutely certain it was much more painful for Valerie to write, to curate, and to let it go. I want to read something that Valerie has written here. What does a person do when she has witnessed so much cruelty and despair, yet never been asked or allowed to speak about it, to recall it, to try to understand, to learn, or to heal from it? Those of us willing to listen to the margins, to listen for the social dynamics of the us and the other. For those, this book contributes to our academic understanding of American society, a value formation that, at least over the last 50 years, has moved the radical to the mainstream. What may have been considered, Rushduni may have been considered radical at one point, is certainly more mainstream. And despite the plethora of academic books that have appeared about Christian nationalism since January the 6th, 2016, I can attest that for my 30 years as an academic working at the intersection of religion and politics in America, most academics have been dismissive of work on the Christian right. It is a minor sect in US politics that has no real power. I've heard that so many times. Only now, post-January 6th, are they realizing the extent of that power and the importance of listening to the voices of those who lived that experience. The second reason I mentioned the quote from Lucy Stone is to draw attention to the need to acknowledge the toll hate takes on us all. Setting boundaries in society is necessary. We create an us and other in our own personal lives. We do it as groups, and all societies do it. Studying the way in which we do that as a society is fascinating to me. Policing the boundaries of society takes an enormous amount of effort. It's important that we set boundaries, and by no means don't take what I'm saying as not advocating boundaries. I absolutely believe that there should be social boundaries, but I also absolutely believe that we as a society should be looking and investigating why those boundaries are there. If you've ever had a house built or had a conversation with an architect or even thought about why a particular door is in a certain place. That's what I do in my own work. Okay, that's how society is, but why is there a door there? Why is there a wall there? Why can't we switch that around a bit? Maybe don't get rid of the house, but maybe we reconstruct it in some way that makes it, I don't know, bigger, more inclusive, providing shelter for all. Hate takes a toll on us. Setting those boundaries, building those boundaries, policing those boundaries takes a toll on us all. And it particularly takes a toll on the victims. It takes a toll on the intentional perpetrators and those who fully believe that in despising others, God's will is being done. I'm a political scientist, and my work focuses on what I think is the rather impressive political strategy of the Christian right. How, in particular, and I don't focus on believers, I focus on political elites, how the political elites of the Christian right have built a loyal constituency over the last 50 years, and how they have had such a huge impact on the American politics. As a political scientist looking at their political strategy, it's incredibly impressive. Partly due to their willingness to cooperate in politics with other believers they think are theologically damned. It's impressive. It's impressive that the right is willing to work politically with others they think are literally going to hell. Something the left seems incapable of doing. And partly, I'm fascinated, due to the effect of this political strategy. The effect that I have been working on recently is the strategic effect to provide theological justification for hate. My background is in political theory, and I'm calling it an ethic of hate. How did they make hating ethical? Well, there's a dynamic there about we need to protect us. And why do we need to protect us? Because we are so exceptional. And therefore, we are exceptional, and therefore we have to exclude others. We have to hold that boundary. We have to hate. It's just important politically for us. Valerie writes, to be sure, we were no different than any other school in many respects. In our drug use, our sexual assault, teenage pregnancy, abuse of alcohol. Yet the additional spiritual burden we carried, our facade of sacred exceptionalism, this was something else. This ethics of hate is grounded, articulated, and framed in theology, and it is potent. And it has become far too ubiquitous in American society. Manifested, of course, in racism, in sexism, and even in sport. I have to, when I'm talking to my British students of American politics, I have to get across to them just how much my little town basketball team hated the other little town's basketball team. Hate is really a part of sport, and if they don't believe that, they really do need to watch a bit more Friday Night Lights. It's a part of who we are. And in fact, it was so much a part of who we are, I have to confess, Valerie, that when I was reading the early part of the book, I thought, isn't this just a child's life? Isn't this just what happens in a child's life? That's how similar our childhood was. How many times did I hear my mother say, sorry? It is the linguistic tell of a Southern lady. Sorry. I've had so many friends in the UK ask me, why do you say sorry so much? Battles are so commonplace in America, in our schools, in our streets, in our churches, and in everyday life. This is what Valerie captures so well in her writing, the everydayness and the power of the ethics of hate in gendered interactions between generations, in pulpits and in pews. Now, I'm not sure, Julie, if I have hate, but let's see if we can go for the, if I have hope, but let's see if we can make something out of this hate. How do you combat such hate? Well, Valerie writes this. I see now the true revolutionary life is the one lived in the quiet, contented places, those which to kingdom warriors seem distastefully ordinary and unremarkable. People of compassion, people of gentleness and generosity, people who desire little else but peace on earth and amble only towards that end, goodwill to all humans they come across. Individually, the stories that Valerie shares with us are incredibly important. And I want to say to you, Valerie, you are not at all lukewarm. Politically, what does this teach us? Well, one of my favorite words recently is diaphobia. And diaphobia, I think, captures what's going on in American politics right now. Diaphobia is the fear of learning from other people, the fear of listening to them, because you might learn something. How do we change? Well, it's a very tough question in American politics right now, trapped in polarization and the two-party system with one side fully closed in the armor of God. There is hope being here, and there is a hope in Valerie telling her stories, and there's a hope in those that wish to listen and engage in dialogue. Thank you, and thank you, Valerie, for writing such an amazing book.
Thank you so much, Angie. What a rich conversation we've already begun to have between our four speakers. We're going to try and I'm going to try and curate some dialogue now. One or two questions have popped into the chat to me. I invite people to drop some questions in and we'll get through as many as we can. I think we might just start by perhaps having a conversation among the speakers. And I'm going to ask a personal question, Valerie, actually, if you'd be willing to answer this. And I just wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the cost of writing this book for you, because obviously this is a story that you live with, but sitting down and collecting these memories, ordering them, writing them, could you just say something about that, maybe, if you want to?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thanks for the question. I think this may come as a surprise, maybe to some people, but I found it incredibly cathartic and wonderful. I found it a wonderful experience. I was in the middle of a study leave period, and I had a traumatic event happen in my personal life, and it just seemed right that I sit down and try to get some things out. And I had been collecting documents, and like any good academic, I had an archive of things to draw from, and it just suddenly came together, and I just sat, and it was absolutely wonderful. I really encourage people who are, I know not everybody processes through writing, but I think there's just something so powerful about putting things down, and also just the kind of dialogue with yourself. You're going, you think, oh, should I write this down? Whatever comes to mind, you write it down, and then you talk about it with yourself. So you're saying, why am I feeling bad about writing this down? Let's work it through. And it's just, it's a beautiful thing to tell the truth. And that's exactly what all this kind of shame and violence that I was talking about, my whole life I've been told, do not talk about this. I mean, explicitly, I was told, do not talk about this until we're dead. We don't air our dirty laundry. And what do we have to be ashamed of? There's nothing, I don't feel any shame. I feel proud to stand with all those that I grew up with, and to link arms with everyone who's been involved in these communities, and to just bask in that sense of being human and being unafraid to be vulnerable.
Thank you. Before I open it up to some of the questions that are popping into the chat, and thank you for those, Caroline, Julie, Angie, have you got things you'd like to say to one another or to Valerie? Or not?
No, I think it's interesting that the three commentators all come from different disciplines, or at least different perspectives on this. I think there is a need for auto-ethnography. Valerie and I hope the university and academics around you appreciate the importance of telling those stories and taking that methodology seriously. I suppose if I don't necessarily want you to answer that now, but in a bit, I want to, at some point in our lives, I want to ask you what's next. But having survived this, you may want to take a while.
Okay, well, I'm going to read one of the questions I've got here. Valerie described her book as angry earlier. And the question is there a female Christian author who's written a biographical account that demonstrates a church that did it well? The questioner says, if so, this juxtaposition would help me to see how Christianity can be corrupted compared to how it can be demonstrated in a healthy way. And this is for any of our speakers, so please do feel free to chip in. Just unmute yourselves and speak.
I'm not going to be able to give you books that you can read, but there are those that are out there that are writing, particularly at this moment, that are women that have been in mainstream denominations, who are at the moment and remain in those, that are writing about struggles with inclusivity. There's some really interesting women in the Methodist Church that are talking about the recent split that the Methodist Church has had around inclusivity or not, and how you can be more inclusive as a church, and how maybe women bring, I'm not an essentialist, but for them, they would talk about how women bring a particular experience of being excluded, and so therefore are able to be more inclusive as leaders in the church.
Thank you. So, something I've read fairly recently and appreciated is a book by Laura Barringer and Scott McKnight called Church Called Tove. It's not a biographical account, but it does critique and offer a positive way forwards, which I think is a very helpful book. Caroline, you've unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to add in there?
I was going to make sure I heard the question correct. They're asking for what kind of recommendations?
Ideally, a biography, something, I suppose, the equal and opposite of Valerie's book, perhaps.
Okay. I find for myself a lot of the womanist writers and liberation theologians help tremendously for me, and so I think it would be quite useful for us maybe to have a list of some of those, but for me, I look at the womanist theologians and liberation theologians.
Just to echo that, I would highly recommend Renita Weems. I have benefited so much from her writing, and some of it is fairly autobiographical in her reflections on her own spiritual life. I'm trying to think of the name of one of the books I've read recently, but it can't come to mind immediately. But Renita Weems, very much recommend.
It took me a moment to formulate an answer because I struggle a little bit with the framing in which there's like that this version of Christianity is somehow a perversion of some true authentic thing that exists out there in the world. And I don't actually think that it does. But I do think that there are forms of Christianity that aren't that are very different from the forms of Christianity that we're talking about today. And a writer whose work comes to mind in that vein is Diana Butler Bass. Much of her work is, she's an accomplished award-winning historian, and was pushed out of an evangelical church on these kinds of, an evangelical college on these kinds of issues, and went on to become an independent writer. So all of her work has an autobiographical quality to it, but it's all grounded in history and scholarship. And so she's written probably 8-10 books at this point. In fact, it's her husband who is the one that thinks that she and I and all of you are a little place for hope. So I think her work is something that people find really beneficial in terms of looking for if one wishes to stay a Christian, a path to doing that, to reconstruct what it might mean to be a Christian in ways that are more inclusive. I think that she's done a lot to make that happen, especially a lot in a language that is familiar to those of us who come from the more evangelical far right side of things, right? So sometimes, I mean, the process theology and all of that is wonderful, but it sometimes rings hollow to those of us whose ears have been shaped by Dominionism, right? So I think that she kind of comes in at a place that's accessible to folks who are trying to rethink things.
Thank you. Some helpful recommendations there. I'm going to move on to another question, if I may. This is about the process of writing auto-ethnography, and so more than one of you might like to answer about this. And the question is, how do you work together the personal, the sociological, and historical, very practically speaking, as a writing process? Did the memory come first, and then and then receive sociological, cultural, academic reflection, or how does that work?
I'll start, and then maybe I think Angie would be a good person to respond next. I was definitely not able to make sense of things as I have now until I received my academic training. I started my career doing ethnography. So I learned, I was trained in tools of observation and synthesis and working with complex data sets, finding patterns. This training was a framework onto which I was able to situate my own experiences after some time. So I would say it's an iterative cycle rather than one thing after another. I would say it's a sort of, at times maybe there's a memory that comes first, but a lot of it is about making connections and identifying themes and links between things, and collecting lots of different things over time. So a lot of time, a lot of these patterns and themes I think are important. Is sort of, you have an idea, and then you want to know what kind of hook to hang it on, and then you start to develop a kind of mind map or a map, a kind of matrix of things, and then you're able to draw all these connections. That's how I would describe it. Angie, is there something you could add to that?
Helen, can you repeat the question so I'll make sure I get the right answer here?
Yes, let me read it to you again. It's about the process of doing autoethnography. How do you weave together the various strands, including your own story, but also the
So my background in terms of training was in political theory, and I was focused in my PhD on particular political values like freedom and justice and equality, and what liberal political theory was writing about with those. So my first works were about that. And then I'm a first generation scholar, and one of the dissonances was becoming an academic while my parents were very proud of me, and just so that we're all very clear, my father was a social justice Wesleyan, so I didn't have a similar experience from my parents in the larger church community, yes, but not with my parents. But there was a dissonance between who I had become, and at the time I did my PhD in Britain, so I'd also weirdly become, somebody who lives abroad, which is weird enough in itself. And so I had been reading all of these different theories, both in terms of liberal political theory and conservative political theory, but also feminist theory. And I wanted to write a book that my mom in particular could understand what I had been doing. So my first book, Below the Belt, is my parents, we couldn't afford holidays. My father never took a vacation, but twice in my childhood, I remember driving across the South, and we only went on back roads, and we camped, and we ate pork and bean sandwiches because we couldn't afford anything else. But we drove from Texas to Atlanta. Oh, well, of course, we couldn't afford to go into Atlanta, but camping and going on the back roads. And so I took that as my methodology, and I got in a car in Texas, and I drove across the South, and I stopped and chatted with people, and I did interviews, and some of the interviews were planned, and they were with particular pastors or with particular academics along the way, but a lot of it was just stopping and eating and talking to people while I ate, and chatting with people along the way, or attending church or baseball games or whatever. And then so the book came out of me reading those stories through the lens of the theories that I had been studying, in a way to communicate to my mother, this is what it means to be a woman in the South. This is what it means to be a man in the South, because masculinity is just as problematic. And this is what, people say about abortion, or this is what people say about homosexuality. And this is how it all gets weaved together, from academic theories to theology to people talking at baseball games. So that was the intent. And I have sympathy with Valerie because, of course, as an academic, when that's published, people go, not quite sure about that. So I then spent the next 10 years writing proper theory and proper academic books, so that policy comparisons. So it was taken seriously.
Thank you. I think that there's another question that was related, and I think maybe we've answered it, but I'll just ask it in case anybody wants to add anything additional. And the question was, could some of the speakers talk about why they were drawn to academia and how their academic work and research has helped them process these life events? Maybe you feel you've addressed that sufficiently, but if anybody wants to add anything, that would be great.
My mom says that I started asking why when I first learned to talk. So I didn't really choose this. I just sort of put one foot in front of the other, and now I'm here. I think it was sort of a natural development for me.
Thank you.
I think many of us go into our disciplines and choose our subjects because we are trying to explain something, and a lot of times perhaps it's unconscious. But I think I've discussed this with many of my colleagues who come to what we study because we might in another life have done that. So we sort of study what we might have done otherwise, or we're trying to explain things, I think. And also for those of us who aren't initially conversant or willing or able to tell our own personal stories, or have language for things that are uncomfortable to tell, by studying it, it's like hand puppets. And I see this sometimes with my students as well. It's more comfortable to talk about someone else's experience than our own.
Thank you. Here's a story question looking for hope. Any stories of perpetrators who've come around, repented, perhaps we might say, and what experiences do they have to share? And actually, I'd like to add a supplementary, which is, what was the process by which that happened? Well, please tell me you've got some story.
I will jump in with a bit of hope there. I have had siblings that have quite happily told me I was going to hell, and didn't speak to me for 20 years. And then pick up the phone at Christmas 20 years later and say, I'm really sorry, I got it all wrong. And now we WhatsApp each other quite regularly. I also, in terms of, reaching for the academic evidence, the academic evidence tells us that the huge changes that happened in America around becoming more inclusive of lesbians and gay men happened because people came out. And you can't hate when it's your family, or at least it's much different. Of course you can, it's more difficult, is what I'll say. It's a hate when it's your family. And with people coming out over the years, people began to not buy into the hate language that the Christian right were perpetuating. And so social attitudes began to shift, and Obergefell happened. And what I see in my own research is the discourse from the Christian right political organizations around lesbians and gay men almost goes completely silent after Obergefell happens, because it's a battle that they've lost. And you don't talk about the battles that you've lost. Now, what gets turned up, what discourse gets turned up at that point is the hate directed towards transsexuals and transgender, because that becomes the new enemy. But there's significant shift in social attitudes over the last 20 years towards gay men and lesbians cannot be underestimated. And that's about people coming out and going, oh, wait a minute, that's not just crazy people marching in New York. This is like my aunt or my nephew or something.
Thank you.
The guy that I mentioned who thought that he knew all about my divorce, he himself is very personally entwined in really high level Reconstructionist prestigious people by marriage, and he has left and emailed me not too long ago to ask if he owed me apologies. So it happens. It does happen. Look at me offering all the hope.
Valerie, do you have any positive stories along those lines?
I'm sure I do. I'm trying to think of some. I think what I can say is that maybe hope doesn't look like, or change doesn't look like what we think. So I know for people who are embedded in these really extremist groups, coming out of that typically happens in stages. And it's often prompted by a crisis, or as Angie's pointed out, someone in the family reveals that they are this scary other that this person has been sort of afraid of and hating. And so I have seen these small shifts in people, so that, they're moving out, and I see that as a sign of hope. And sometimes I get impatient. I often get impatient about it. I expect them. I think, okay, look, you're still in it. You've just moved into another group. But, I started my career looking at change. One of the things I looked at is theories of change. And one thing I learned from that is change takes a lot of time. And so we have to be looking out for these small whispers of hope. And that even is an act of resistance against Dominionism, this kind of conquering, well, we're going to all change overnight. We're all going to be victorious. And, that often change happens in unexpected ways. It happens in secret ways. So people message me something they're afraid to say publicly, but that even is a sign they're asking, they're questioning, they're moving. So I take hope from that.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question. This is about inviting some reflection on the UK context. The idea of, or the question that you asked, Angie, about how do they make hate ethical, the idea of an ethics of hate. You're living in the UK. Do you see that resonating in the UK? And have you or anyone else written on that in the UK context?
What I have written about is the way in which, because my focus is on the political organizations, the way in which those political organizations are having outposts in the UK and other aspects of other places in Europe and around the world. And what I mean by outpost is that there's a number of organizations in the UK whose workers have been trained by the Family Research Council or the Alliance Defending Freedom. So they go over and get trained, or those organizations will send people here to train them. The Alliance Defending Freedom has a office in London, in Paris, in Brussels, in Stockholm, I believe it is. And so with those outposts come the language and the discourse. So you can begin to see, and I've got a project at the moment that maps the language that's being used by these political organizations in the US and how that's being picked up by conservative politicians in the UK. There have been for years that aspect on the more radical, well, the more far right religious groups in the UK, some Catholics and some more far right Christians in the UK, particularly using language around abortion that have come straight from the US. But it hasn't been as mainstream as it is now, but we can now map how it's becoming more mainstream in the political dialogue.
Thank you. I'm minded of something I read ages ago now by Slavoj Žižek, who says that politics is constructing itself. It's the employment of fear, and therefore the construction of self in distinction to other.
And I'm sure the UK audience knows oranges are not the only fruit. And that certainly tells us some very significant stories about the religion, very like Valerie's work and auto-ethnography of what it means to grow up in religious communities in South Wales. And a very important book for British people understanding that cult.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that, or anything related? Valerie, you live in the UK. What connections do you see here?
Well, I was unpleasantly surprised by the connections. One of the reasons I moved here was to get away from what was happening in the United States. And unfortunately, humans are humans. You know, we find a lot of the same behaviors here, and especially because American versions of especially white evangelicalism are so productive. You know, they're a big industry. So they're shipping books over, they're shipping speakers over, they have a lot of money and influence, and British religious leaders are being courted by that, and they are influenced by that and tempted by it. And so I'm just sad to say I've seen it quite in terrible ways. And a lot of it, the same kind of patterns of identifying some kind of scary other and, acting like it's nothing to do with the congregation. So it's nothing to do with us. It doesn't exist within our community. It's something out there that threatens our way of life. And then, the concealment happens. So anyone in the community can't talk about the fact that they are also, grappling with issues. I'm talking very vague ways, but I mean, you could talk about any of these issues. You could talk about gay marriage, for example, and how this is sort of seen as something that's out there, that's threatening the church. And And so the concealment of people's everyday lives in the church, that pattern creates a pressure cooker, and people become unable to talk about things that they're thinking through, and matters of identity. So it's, and then that crops up in the rhetoric of politicians. You know, they're increasingly realizing that they have a base there to foster and to nurture. And especially around the pandemic, you know, a lot of fear is being exploited. So it's a different kettle of fish maybe in the United Kingdom in some ways. You know, we don't have exactly the same situation as in the United States, obviously, but a lot of the same things are going on.
Thank you. Something that the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence has been working on lately is we recently had a consultation around the UK Church's response to the radical right. It was a closed consultation, but we hope to be producing some resources going out from that. And we were engaging with a book called The Claim to Christianity by Hannah Stroman and Ulrich Schmeidel. So Stroman and Schmeidel look at some of the Christian theological claims, or the apparently Christian theological claims made by far-right groups in Europe and in the UK, and they use 4 test cases, and then consider how Christianity is being used to, and although they don't use the language of an ethic of hate, I think that actually what they're describing is something quite similar to that. So it's a book worth reading and pondering, I think, for those who are interested in that.
Can I just add something? For years, I was told, oh, well, you know, when I would talk about religion and politics, British people would say, oh, no, we don't do that in politics. We're not like you weird Americans. We don't do that sort of thing. And if you look at the numbers, overall, British people are becoming less religious, attending church less, and the Church of England and many other denominations are really struggling. But the one group, for a very long time, the one group that was growing were independent churches, and that was the only group in British religious demography that was growing. I'll just if you don't mind, I'd like to ask Valerie a question about the use of the term Christian nationalism, and maybe the other to reflect on the sudden appearance that it's just the cool thing now to be writing about, as an academic, to be writing about Christian nationalism. Thousands of books are suddenly, it's like academics has just discovered it. I'm resisting, and the reason I'm resisting is because I don't think it's a nationalist project. Dominionism is far too big for that. The investment in the UK, the investment in Uganda, the investment around the world by these political organizations is too large. But I'm curious about that phrase, and if that's just me being a grumpy old person, not using the language.
No, I want to start immediately here because I'm so with you. I find it a little bit, not more than a little bit, annoying. And especially because I think this kind of like, we've got to identify what it is, and it's its own unique entity. It's a very, it's even, some people will say like, oh, it's unique to the United States. So recently I was talking to somebody who said, oh, Christian nationalism is not an issue in the UK. And it's just a manifestation of dominionism. And all you have to do is look at the quotes, or the kind of the writings of people who have these kind of, I'll just use the term Christian nationalist views, which basically means they want to exercise dominion first regionally. So they're like in my own background, okay, they wanted to get control over their county, their local county. They wanted to get people into the political seats in the county where they lived, and then it was just outward from there. And so they used the language of, oh, America, America's a Christian nation, we have to get back to our past. It's just a mechanism to appeal to something very core to human beings, which is this sense of like, I'm special, I'm from the United States, or I'm from Great Britain, and Great Britain's a really special country. And it's not so special if you say like, oh, I'm from Cobb County. Like we want to have the sense of greatness of okay, we've got this, like, our country has this amazing history. It's just a political ploy. And what they actually want, and I think in every case I've looked at across not just Christian Reconstructionists, but a lot of the Kingdom Now, New Apostolic Reformation, which is from sort of latter rain theology, is they want world domination, and they're very explicit about that. I mean, there was a quote that I used in my book, I think it was from George Grant, who said, you know, he's like really blunt, like, what we want is world domination. So the Christian nationalism movement is just a pit stop. And I think it is manipulative in that sense, because it is, and you've talked about this, Angie, really well, is that, you know, it's really effective. What you're getting, you're playing to people's desire to feel this sense of specialness. And, you know, that strikes at the core of our identity. We want to be part of a community that means something, that is like, we're so good and you're so bad over there. We're so special. We have this, you know, something that's unique from you. And, you know, talking about ourselves as global citizens is not, you know, it's too inclusive. So Christian nationalism I find it a helpful term, but we have to keep in mind that it is just one aspect of a much larger agenda.
So this is the first context where I have found people that I'm in agreement with on this topic. I do use the term also, Valerie, in part because it's the term of the day. And when I say that, it points people to the people that I'm talking about. So that's my goal. But from the US perspective, I've been writing about this, and I didn't really write about how it was transnational. And I think I'm going to go back and do some revision on that, because I think that's really important. But even in the US perspective, we have the old Christian right, we have the new Christian right, we have the religious right, we have the Tea Party. These are all the same people. And about every 7 or 8 years, someone comes along and says, oh, that's just dying away. Right. And they rename it, and it comes out as though it's something new. But what happens is we lose that power thread. Angie, I was happy to hear you talk about the 50 years in which this movement has been building, because most people don't even recognize that. And they don't recognize it is because we keep changing the language that we use to talk about it. But it's at least from the 1950s, when this kind of Dominion mandate took hold in a small corner of Presbyterianism that made its way out into the rest of it, at least the evangelicalism in the US, largely with Christian schools and Christian homeschools. And it transformed that evangelical movement toward Dominionism. And that's what we're talking about. And I one of the advantages of calling it Christian nationalism instead of what I want to call it, which is in the US context, I want to call it evangelicalism, because I want people to recognize the way in which that tradition sowed these seeds of apocalypticism and conspiracism and paranoia about persecution and all those kinds of things. And we lose that thread if we reimagine this every couple of years. So I'm complete agreement, and I'm unhappy with the shift. One of the advantages of the shift, though, is that it is bigger than evangelicalism, and in particular in the US, it has a lot to do with Catholics these days. So there is that gets captured in the new language, but this is really complex, and we should not simplistically just do a complete changeover in vocabulary every 7 or 8 years. We lose too much.
The historian in me says, it goes farther back. The Confederate States of America were Christian nationalists, sectional in the larger scheme of things, but they very much viewed themselves as a Christian nation, empire throughout the global. They're going to go, throughout the global South, going farther south. And so that's why, again, it's not an accident that when they come along later, they're neo-Confederates. And using that symbolism, which people in other countries are adopting as well. They're drawn to it. The Confederate States were explicitly Christian nationalists.
Thank you. Thank you all for
One more thing, even the Puritans, the
Okay.
city on a hill.
Mm.
I don't know that there's an origin to it.
Thank you. I'm going to read another question. It's just popped in. This might be, looking at time, this might be our last one, depending on how long this takes. We've promised to finish within the 2 hours. So just for those who are watching the clock, we will finish by past. So this question says, I'm interested in the comments Valerie makes in her book about the secret things and those following the path of peace in obscurity. How do we navigate the tension between the importance of that reality and the desire to gain influence, which we think is for good? How do we avoid becoming our own version of Dominionists while seeking to do good? And I will say that as a UK Baptist minister, I very, very different from the Southern Baptist Convention. But I would say that I definitely have opinions on this matter to do with the separation of church and state and not seeking to center ourselves. But I think the panel will have more to say.
This is something I talk about with my neighbor all the time. And my neighbor is a linguist and we meet together quite a lot. We have a lot of discussions about this because we're both in the union. And this goes back to sort of my work on the nature of change and how, you tend to have, I think Carol Ann can talk to us from a historical perspective on this, but looking at history of change, and I teach on the ways that theories become popular and then how they're disrupted. And so I'm quite interested in how people become people of influence, and then what you have is you tend to have the center, right? You have the center of society who they have influence, they have power, they have, they're dictating, our social practices and what's popular and all these kind of things. And then you have people on the margins who are either oppressed or they're oppressed and also maybe resisting. And then, there may be a revolution, and then those people move towards the center. And then, over time that can become the center. And so you have this sort of iteration constantly of people who are acting in revolution against what is sort of the center, and then they maybe amass power, and power corrupts, so they become part of the center. And so what we often talk about what I talk about with my neighbor is how I always want to be questioning. I always want to be staying kind of away from that center place. When I start to become cool, or I start to become part of the in crowd, or I start to become, if we talk about this in academic terms, I'm doing things that everybody else is doing. I'm sort of saying things that everybody's nodding their head and saying, yeah, that's right, that's good. Think, okay, wait a second, this is perhaps a dangerous place to be. Because once we start amassing this sense of we're all right, we're doing everything right, everything's good, that's when you start to exclude people, you start to overlook things. So I think a place of influence is a dangerous place to be, in terms of when we think of influence in terms of people who are at that sort of operating at the core, at the center. So that's maybe a sort of abstract way to put it, but that's my thoughts on that.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, well, in that case, I think we might start drawing some threads together. I want to say a huge thank you to Valerie for allowing us to look at the book. There's a vulnerability in launching a book. There's a vulnerability in telling a story in the honest way you have, and real courage there. And hugely grateful to you, and really hoping that the book will be widely read, will be influential, will change hearts and minds, and in the ways that you've been speaking about, yeah, will help people to begin to process their own stories and persuade others of the importance of what's going on. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists who've engaged so thoughtfully and so helpfully. Really, just a whole load of rich thoughts and ideas. Really appreciate all of your insights. I wanted to close, if I may, with another short reading from the book. Let me just find the page a second. And it's been so encouraging to hear some glimpses of hope, despite the appalling story that we read in these pages. And I'm aware that in this Zoom room we have people of faith and people without faith, and people who have lost or rejected their faith because of the harm that has been done to them. So I don't draw any assumptions about where people in the room want to position themselves, but I wanted to just read these words of Valerie's to close. Just a little moment of glory, I thought, as I was reading the book. I'm reading, if you're interested, from page 86, a little bit from page 86, a little bit from page 87. And she's speaking about, she is a child at this stage, and she says, as I got older, an experience taught me to trust in each new day's potential. I looked beyond just the concrete, things I could touch and handle and carry, to the abstract, even the fleeting, the reassuring touch of soap and warm water on my face, the hectic push of wind against my back, the resolution of my breath as I climbed a hill on my bike, the susurration of the wind moving across leaves, a hug of hot soup in my stomach. And she goes on to say, initially I had no conscious idea of who might be the giver of these gifts. The universe maybe, or maybe they came to me through the power of my own summoning. This thought thrilled me for quite some time. But as the years went by, I came to think that maybe, after all, it was God, who, as he travelled in and amongst the hills and valleys of heaven and earth, came to where I was. And when he saw me, he took pity on me and wrote my name upon the artifacts of the earth, storing them in stealth for me alone to spy and hold in my desperate hands. This was the comfort of my childhood, that perhaps the God we worshipped weekly was in truth a false God, and not this God of small things who met me in the woods, in a tree, or in a gutter, a God I'd come to look for, wonder about, and expect. My God of the lost and found. Beautiful words, which I hope will give us hope. So once again, many thanks to those of you who joined us. A huge thanks to our panel and to Valerie. And we'll say good night.